So for today's session, I'm delighted to introduce, no particular order, Benjamin Wakefield, who's here on the left, the research fellow in the Global Health Programme at Chatham House, amongst other things. His main research interests include global health security, biological and chemical aspects of CBRN, non-proliferation and conflict issues. We also have Evie Matthews, who's a policy analyst at AQA, the largest exam board in England, and she principally works in AQI, which is a new think tank powered by AQA. Joining us on Zoom, we have Juan Gomez, experienced executive director, consultant and entrepreneur, who has a history of working in non-profit organisations with a particular focus on young people and social impact. And finally, we have Rosie Beacon, a senior policy analyst at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. He's also worked as a consultant, a research intern, and a political correspondence intern in the House of Parliament. So without further ado, let's get started. My first question for the panelists is, what inspired you to get involved in your industry, and are you doing what you thought you'd be doing when you were at uni? Ben, let's start with you.
Start with me? Okay. Well, I am in the space that I thought I would be after university, because my undergraduate was in international relations. I had a year in doing global politics and journalism in Australia, and then I did my master's here at UCL in security studies. So I always wanted to end up in either government, think tanks, or military. My original plan was to go to Sandhurst and be a military officer, but by the time I sort of graduated, my eyesight was too bad, so that one went out the window. And fortunately, I ended up at Chatham House in think tanking. I didn't expect global health particularly to be where I would end up, but I sort of work across our global health and international security teams, as you can probably imagine from what Will said in his description of my research interests. So that's sort of a fairly brief intro to sort of how I got to where I am and that I am where I expected, because I was always sort of on that trajectory of IR and security. But I can go into more detail later. But,
yeah, brilliant, thank you. And Rosie, what about you?
In terms of what inspired me to get into it, I mean, I've always been politically engaged. I've always been really interested in politics and policy. And I was more enamored by the policy side of politics. So getting stuck into big, chunky policy issues and actually looking at the evidence and substance beneath them, and not just kind of looking at the tug of war of politics and kind of the machinations of Parliament and political parties. I kind of identified early on that I wanted to get more into the policy side of things. Naturally, when you get more into the policy side of things, you do get into the more political side of things, because if you have policies you want to influence people with, you have to understand how politics works and pressure points that they respond to. But basically, I was inspired to go into working in a think tank because I always liked Tony Blair, and I thought he was bang on the money about the policy areas that I was really interested in. So when a job came up, I really wanted to get it, and so here I am. In terms of if it's what I expected I'd be doing when I was at university, yes. I worked in consulting for about 2 years when I left university as kind of like a stopgap. I didn't really want to do it that much, but it was better than being unemployed at home. So I did it, and then when this job came up at the Institute, I left. If you do want to, go into policy or politics, but you can't quite find the job when you leave university, it's a really good idea to do anything basically that gives you some sort of credibility. And it did actually really help, and I enjoyed it as well when it actually came down to it. But I stayed conscious throughout those 2 years that I knew I eventually wanted to leave and do something more attuned to my personal interests. So yeah, it's kind of what I expected I'd be doing when I was at university. I studied history when I was here as well, so it was very kind of politically orientated, and it helped me cultivate a lot of my critical thinking skills as well, which I didn't really want to let go of when I left university. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, great, thank you. And Juan, we'll come to you next.
Of course, thank you for the invitation. Can you hear me properly? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, good. In terms of inspiration, I guess the short answer would be that by 2014, I kind of realized that most of my friends were going into consulting, working for big corporations, etc. And I thought to myself that I would have to choose between making a living or working for my, in the defense of my values, principles, etc. So I decided that I could do both, or I would try at least, meaning I could make a living by defending or upholding these values. That meant to engage in a work of consulting, really, with deeply value-charged, so to speak, or ideological organizations, which for the most part would mean to work as a consultant for think tanks, lobbying firms, NGOs, etc. And some of which would later on offer me, positions within the organizations to help fix whatever it is that I had said previously that was wrong with them. And that got to the point where I am right now, which is really exciting.
Great, thank you. And finally, Evie, or do you prefer Evie or Evangeline?
We'll go with Evie, it's easier. So yeah, similarly to Rosie, I was in a position after my postgraduate degree that I finished about a year ago, that I was more interested in policy rather than politics. So the sort of nitty-gritty areas of how do we implement effective policy, how do we define effective policy, and so forth. So during my dissertation, I was applying for various different jobs. They were internships, and then a policy analyst position at AQA turned up that I applied for and I didn't think I'd get. So in terms of answering the question, is it something that I thought I'd do? Education? No. Am I glad I did it? Yes. So I think this might be a question that's later on, but in terms of whether people should apply for jobs that they're specifically interested in, yes, but I think it's normally a more pragmatic option later down the line. At the minute, I think there are quite a few jobs that are going related to policy, so I think anything that you have the time to sort of spend doing an application on is worth doing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I realised I missed out on everything about the report. I'm gonna jump in with the story, but I could. Do you mind if I jump back?
No, go ahead.
Lots of interesting answers, so I thought I'd add something similar. I always want to do something that I felt was. I'm quite a purpose-driven person, so I wanted to do something where I felt I was contributing. And when I was sort of in the position of graduating, I was looking at all the traditional things like finance and consulting, and all of my friends went into law firms and banks and things like that, but I didn't think I would be satisfied with that. And I think this sector can give you that balance where you are mentally stimulated, but you feel like you're contributing to something bigger, which for me was quite an important thing personally. So that's something to think about. And also with think tanks, there's a huge variety as well. So Chatham House is independent, for instance. So we are non-partisan. We don't have a political leaning or an agenda or institutional positions on anything, which is what drew me to Chatham House, whereas other think tanks may be left-leaning or right-leaning or have an agenda on certain issues. So that's something to think about as well. What kind of thing would fit for you personally? What kind of thing are you interested in when you're looking at places to apply? Because there can be a very different experience in different think tanks depending on what their sort of mission is.
Yeah, it also depends on funding. If we can go deeper into the weeds of think tanks,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's so many things that can affect the quality of work and life in a think tank, and funding is definitely one of them.
Yeah.
A lot of the bigger think tanks are quite fortunate in that they are well funded. The smaller think tanks are often beholden to the requests of funders asking for specific areas of research, which is also another thing to keep in mind. And if you get to an interview at a think tank, it's something worth asking, I would say.
That's good advice. And I think also think tanks, and what everyone has said, they give you this bridge between academia and policy. So you can work on the issues that you find interesting, that you've enjoyed at university, but they have a pragmatic and real, they can have a pragmatic and real world impact. So it's not sort of just ivory tower stuff, or hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, that's what we try to do. So you can still be sort of mentally stimulated, but contributing to sort of real world impact. That's the whole point.
Thank you. And so sort of following on from that, what do you think are some of the challenges that you face, maybe individually or maybe as the organizations that you work for, maybe possibly due to the fact that you're a think tank or an NGO rather than a private corporation, or just generally? Evie, will come to you first.
I think there are certain parameters of what you can do, as sort of mentioned in terms of funding. I think that being a think tank, you generally can streamline into specific research areas, which can mean that there are certain issues that occur at different times that you may not necessarily have the level of funding to explore properly. And it may lead to sort of other organisations exploring that in more depth, which can sometimes feel like a missed research opportunity, which can be quite unfortunate. But I think in a total, it really does come down to what the degree of specialisation in that think tank. That sort of, in the past year, that's what I've experienced, can really sort of exacerbate or limit the sort of impact you can have on specific policy areas.
Rosie?
In terms of the challenges, yeah, it's a really fun job, but there's a number of things that are worth keeping in mind when you're looking at the think tank world. So just to explain how think tanks work briefly, as we alluded to slightly in the last point, there's like a political ecosystem, and you have kind of think tanks and public intellectuals on one side. You have kind of civil society organizations, which could be like charities like the NSPCC, that all campaign groups are pursuing a particular aim. Then down here you've got media, journalists, got actual government, and then you've got the opposition. And it's very much an ecosystem because people overlap all the time. But basically, my point here is that you're in the public domain, like your work is being published, you have a public profile, and that comes with ups and downs. Like, you meet a lot of people that are sometimes quite vain and self-serving, you meet a lot of really brilliant people, but ultimately it means that you have to be like really conscious how you present yourself in public a lot of the time. Like, working for Tony Blair, understandably, I get trolled a lot on social media, and it's definitely something worth thinking about if you're a woman. If you're going into something like this and you'll have a public profile, you often have to write in the media, and sometimes you get a backlash. That's like the personal stuff. In terms of the actual job, while think tanks can be really impactful, and I do agree that they are really impactful and they're not just kind of ivory tower stuff, sometimes when you're in the thick of it, like doing research, and you publish like this really lengthy paper that you think you put loads of work into, it does feel quite disconnected from the impact sometimes. And eventually 3 months down the line, you'll be able to put this paper on a minister's desk, and that, you know, it will have its impact then. But sometimes it does feel a bit disconnected from the policy ecosystem and the chain of command being in a think tank. And that could be like, if you're going in it to have impact and you don't get it, it can be a bit dissatisfying, but at the same time, it's really intellectually stimulating. So it kind of balances out sometimes. On the whole, it's really good and everything nets off. But those are probably my two biggest challenges. I mean, I don't mind as much about the public profile stuff because it's kind of something you just like, sometimes you take on the chin, but other days it's like, you know, we get people trying to call you out on social media and embarrass you, like it's annoying. And maybe it's unique when I work for someone that's like as divisive as Tony Blair is, and I fully recognise that. But I do think that it's that even in the big prolific think tanks like, you know, Institute for Government Policy Exchange, Demos, like they'll all have similar problems too, I'd imagine.
And Juan, what would you say?
I would first distinguish between the challenges that the sector as a whole encounters in terms of, and I would agree in terms of impact, in terms of budgetary constraints or funding, etc. And then at the same time, the challenge that we as professionals, right, trying to have a career on these organizations also encounter, which for the most part are fairly similar, because lack of funding not only affects impact, but also affects individuals working within these organizations, etc. Now, I would say that luckily for most of you, I guess, you will try to have a career on this sector in the Anglosphere, which is much better, I say, than continental Europe when it comes to, you know, the vibrancy and the strength of civil society organizations, think tanks, institutions, etc. Continental Europe, I think, at least as I can tell from my experience in Spain, France, and some of the EU member states, that would be more of a desert when it comes to civil society organizations. Also, in terms of culture, etc., of fundraising or giving money for these initiatives, everything is much smaller. The impact is much smaller, and also this sector is lacking professionalism to a great extent. That's, for instance, what led me to my work as a consultant prior to being an executive of, in some of these organizations. Because on the one hand, I realized that I had to help them out become more professional, to have a greater impact. And by doing so, at the same time, I would be creating the demand for my own services, because otherwise I wouldn't have a sector to work with at all. So that would be my particular challenge. But again, the reality, I think, in the case of Spain or continental Europe in general, is very different from the one you will find in the UK or the US, for instance.
Very interesting to hear that there's a difference between those two. And Ben, anything to add on the challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything that people have said, to be honest, and funding is one of the biggest ones that sticks out. Even for a big think tank like Chatham House, we still have to raise funds for almost every project we do. So it ends up being that a lot of your role, even as a researcher, is fundraising. And I think one of the challenges as when people come into working in a think tank as a researcher, some people are blindsided by what the scope of work actually is. You don't get to just go and interview people and do research and write papers and be very intelligent and all that kind of thing. You have to do lots of administration, budgeting, financial management, fundraising. Unless you're lucky to have a really big team that can support all of that, it's a very multifaceted job, especially at the more entry-level and mid-level roles. So that's something to be aware of, because some people are surprised when they come into doing research or come into an internship and they think they'll just be in the library writing papers all day, and it's very much not like that. Agree with the impact thing. Sometimes it can be very hard to tell, even if you have had an impact, even if something comes of something that you've written, it's hard to necessarily make a concrete connection between the two. And I don't know if there's any medics in the room, but I think it's similar to if you're a clinician and you're treating patients. If you save one life or you make someone better, there's a clear, obvious impact. But if you work in public health and you implement a policy that saves thousands of lives, you don't necessarily see it, but you know that it's sort of happened. So that's something that you have to get used to, and that it can be challenging, because sometimes you might spend a year doing some work, have all these recommendations for policies, and then whichever government you're targeting or multilateral just goes a different way and nothing happens. So it's marginal gains. It's not necessarily always really clear reward when you're doing that kind of thing and looking for impact. And the other thing I would say in terms of individual challenges is it's a hugely competitive industry to get into. And then when you're in it, it's not particularly well paid. And that's something that you kind of have to go into with your eyes open, because especially as UCL graduates, you will have a lot of opportunities. You'll be looking at private sector roles, but you've got to think about what you value in terms of your overall life as well. You know, the interest of your work, the impact, your hours, how it makes you feel, where that can take you. And then salary and benefits is another part of that, but it's something to be aware of, because it will be a continued frustration throughout your career, especially when you look at your peers who will be earning a lot, orders of magnitude more than you sometimes. But you just have to go into that with your eyes open. And there are opportunities afterwards and different consulting things you can do in more highly paid roles as you get more senior. But I think it's important to sort of flag that. And the competition is a big one. I mean, we had our internship recruitment a month or two ago. We had 8 roles across all of our programs. We had 1,600 applications. So that's the sort of, and of those, there's hardly any follow-on entry-level roles. So it can be very competitive. I mean, in my final year at UCL, I applied to so many places, lots of small think tanks, NGOs, research institutes. I didn't hear back from any of them really until the Chatham House internship. So fortunately, it worked out quite well for me, but it can be a tough slog where you're really trying to apply and do something impactful and working in a sector that you feel is important, and then there will be sort of setbacks and there will be rejection. So you've got to be aware of that as well. And sort of, like people say, put lots of applications in, look at lots of different options to build skills. And if you're committed to it, then you will get there eventually. But you need to be persistent and you need to be tough, because there will be rejection. And there'll probably be a lot of it.
And on the roles as well, it's also, sorry to interject, I think that's all really good points. And I think it's also worth remembering when you eventually do get a job, that you've got to kind of like make your own fortune. Sorry, I'm really bad with cliches, but like you have to drive your own agenda, like a lot of the time. Like if you've got interests, I think you should always make sure that you're pushing them. Like a lot of it, like we say, is driven by funding, but from my experience, if you've got an interest and you make it clear to people, you can do work in it and embed it into your work, and it makes you unique and it makes you stand out. And it shows an independence of thought. It's generally a valuable thing to know exactly what you want out of a role in a think tank and what your personal interests are, because it really helps with progression from my experience. And another thing is also that it's also worth remembering that like a lot of the people in think tanks, like they do it because they like it, as Ben alluded to. And that means that sometimes even when you get to the more senior levels, they're not necessarily managers, they're just really, really experienced analysts. And so it's like, it's not like conventional jobs when you come out of uni. When you get more senior, you take on more managerial responsibilities. A lot of the time, the most senior people in the organization are like immensely intelligent and experienced, and it's a slightly different dynamic. It doesn't necessarily make them bad managers a lot of the time, but it's something worth thinking about. And they don't lose like this relentless ambition to maybe one day go into office and things like that. So it's another thing worth thinking about, that the layers of the hierarchy are very different to when you're in the private sector, I would say, when you're like working with public intellectuals.
Absolutely. And I think that you have to make your own fortune thing is a really important point. You have to try and shape your career and get involved in things that you're interested in, be proactive, and agree about the management part. You have to sort of seek out mentors who might not even be your direct line managers or even in your team. So you've got to be really proactive and really driven, I think, once you're in. Totally agree.
So it's interesting you talk about the competitive nature of the industry. I guess just carrying on in that vein, what piece of advice would you give to a student who was looking to join that industry? And Kwan, we'll go to you first.
Sorry, can you repeat the question, William, please?
So what advice would you give to a student who was looking to go into NGOs or think tanks?
Well, the same. It was just mentioned, to be persistent, because there will be rejection. That's for sure. I think it was also very valuable to flag the fact that this is not a very well-paid sector. So the sooner you realize that and you come to terms with it, the better. Otherwise, you will be dissatisfied, because you will see other people progressing much faster than you are, at least in at that aspect of your professional life, meaning salary, etc. I don't know, my experience really, because I jumped on the board of the think tank world at a managerial level, more than as an analyst or as a researcher. My experience really was that it's fairly easy to attract human capital, especially right after university, etc., through internships, fellowships, and all that sort. So again, I would encourage everyone to apply to all these positions, because there are many. Now, what is really tricky, and this is not a suggestion really, but just a fact that I would like to highlight. It's a bit frustrating that although these organizations have it fairly easy because there are so many people applying, etc., to attract talent, to attract human capital, it's fairly difficult because of budgetary constraints and because of these overlaps and constant jumps between the public sector, the private sector, politics, etc. It's fairly difficult to retain or to keep human capital. which in turn creates, well, an unstable environment in terms of structure, in terms of people, in terms of stuff. And that in turn undermines the impact of an organization. So I like to point that out. In terms of advice for those who want to get into this sector and apply to these organizations, I would, to be honest, I've had experiences, both good and bad ones, of people, becoming specialists or trying to fit into that role, especially when it comes to research, to be a specialist on a field. Again, that would depend also on the nature of the organization. But some other times, these organizations, especially when they become more and more professional in their work, they would also hire people with lower degree of specialization in a given field, but which are able to also adapt to changing circumstances, which is for the most part what these organizations do, especially those that are created as essentially startups, thought and value-driven startups. That's the experience in countries where civil society organizations have been lacking for, historically. Maybe that's not the case in the UK, but that has been my experience, for instance, in Spain. So Spanish think tanks, foundations, charities, NGOs would be hiring, obviously, specialists, but also people who are just well trained to adapt to changing circumstances. And that, I think that's something that people trying to get into these sectors sometimes, miss out, and they try to at least show a very specific profile when it comes to field of expertise and techniques, skills, etc. But that's not really what these think tanks are looking for. Also because of budgetary constraints, they just can't have openings for every single tiny detail within the organizations. They just need people that are able and fit to fill different roles when needed.
Great, thank you very much. And Evie, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, so I think a piece of advice for applying for jobs and going into the sector would be capitalising on your skill sets, particularly a basic core set of skills. So when I was applying for AQA, I did an interview and I sort of went through some of the experience I had, so contributing to some of the professors' work at undergraduate degree, and also talking about the modules that I did as part of my master's. And then I got a follow-up interview where I was asked to actually produce a copy of my not yet finished dissertation, which was quite scary, within 24 hours. Yeah, so I had to show some of the graphs that I was producing. Obviously, they didn't want it completely finished, but that was what really sort of got me the job, for sort of showing that I knew how to run OLS regressions, how to do content analysis, things like that. So yeah, I think, as sort of was mentioned before, don't feel that you need to demonstrate yourself as an expert for each job that you're applying for. Acknowledge the fact that you might not be a field expert in justice policy or education policy, because that's really what they're looking for, to sort of capitalise on those skill sets, but also acknowledge that you're not an expert and there are things to learn. So that would really be my advice.
Great. Rosie, is there anything else there? I know you said quite well.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things. There's like some proactive things you can do. There's like some more elusive things you can do, which might be a bit fluffy, but I think it would still be helpful to say. And then like actual tips when you're doing the job application. So things you can do now. What I was talking about with a public profile earlier, anyone can have a public profile. Make yourself a Twitter account, make yourself a blog. That's what will make you really stand out, and it will give you practicing your writing skills, putting together opinions, summarizing your opinions down to 200 characters. And if you write good stuff, people will notice and you'll get followers, and the people that will follow you will be credible, and they'll be recruiting for jobs at some point, and maybe they'll message you. Even if they don't message you, on your CV, you can put your Twitter account and they can have a look, and it's essentially just a repertoire of your thoughts. And it's really useful to have because it shows that you're like making an active effort in your spare time to go out there, put yourself out there, do analysis. And if if your thoughts are well calculated, they're well evidenced, they'll say and be, oh yeah, no, that's a really good point, let's take them to interview. They're clearly original and interesting and make an effort to do something. So put yourself out there on Twitter, on Substack. LinkedIn is good, but for something like Think Tank, which is like, it's not necessarily partisan, like whether you're in a left wing or right wing think tank, but it's political, and inevitably because policy is political. So it's a really useful thing to do, to just put yourself out there. That's one thing that I think I would always look like. We actually, as an FYI, we will be recruiting for an intern over the next 6 months, but that's something I would look for in an application or when I'm interviewing an intern. In terms of elusive things you can do, read. Everyone's clever. Everyone that applies to these jobs is clever. You have to assume a baseline of intelligence. Lots of people go to lots of people go to very good universities and are very clever. And so we need to find a way of distinguishing between those people. And the best way to distinguish between them is how they think. It's not what you know. Anyone can produce a policy report if they put their mind to it. That's essentially what we're all doing at university right now. But it's your original opinions, how much you question things. Critical thinking skills are critical. They are fundamental for work in a think tank. You can't just blindly accept things. And the best way to practice that is to read loads. And actually, politicians write lots of really good books, really insightful. I mean, like you could read like philosophy books, but I actually think some of the best stuff I've read has been stuff by like, sounds really generic, but the stuff that really made me think about things was like Nick Clegg's book, which was I think called Between the Extremes, or the stuff that really made me think about UK politics anyway. And there's actually like a gajillion books I could recommend, but that one always stands out in my head for some reason. And then tips for applications on your cover letter. That CV needs to be 1 page, make it look really nice and slick, and not too crammed. And your cover letter, show in your cover letters that you're really thinking about things in a different way to other people, and really suck up to them as well and be like, it would be an honor to work for your organization. That's what worked for me at the Institute, so I'm assuming it would work for everyone. I don't know if it's like a foolproof recipe to getting a job, but just try it. And if it doesn't work, try something else. But definitely make sure in your cover letters that you're coming across as a really original thinker. Like I say, loads of smart people in the world. You just need to prove yourself as somebody different.
Yeah, it's a lot of great advice there. And Ben, is there anything else you'd like to put on?
Some really good points. Just to nail down on a couple of them. Whichever stage you're at in your career, whether you're an undergrad, postgrad, you're a graduate, build your skills across a broad section of skills. So administrative, coordination skills, writing and research, public speaking, presentations. I think those are sort of the big 4 areas that I would say. And that you can draw on anything you've done at university, volunteer organizations, volunteering positions at university or internships. I know not everyone has the space or time to volunteer as well, so don't be afraid to build on other jobs that you've done, even normal jobs. There's plenty of transferable skills from working in a cafe or working in a supermarket that you can put on an application to show that you've done other things, not just been at university. So when I look at CVs and I see things like that, I can still draw out skills from that. So do that. I agree with, if you're having a public profile, it can be a very good way. I have a professional Twitter. Obviously, I only do professional stuff on that, focused in my area of interest. So I would suggest you do that too. So completely echo Rose's remarks on that, but be careful because it can go the other way. You have to treat that as a personal brand there, and you have to be careful what you're posting. So don't post things in the heat of the moment. Don't post, obvious advice. Because it can reflect badly on you, and people will look back through it. And if something's come out in the news and you've posted something immediately and it's sort of rude or not very thought through, then that you've got to be careful of that kind of thing. But it can be a really good way to build your personal brand. Apply to lots of different things. If you want to be in a think tank, but there's only a couple of positions away, look at other NGOs, look at research institutes, look at charities, look for internships and traineeships. There's lots of them around. Follow organizations on LinkedIn, Twitter, sign up to all their job alerts, follow people that work at those organizations because they will post about them. And then you'll sort of have a constant stream of jobs coming through, things like that. And then when you are applying, research the institution. So make sure your cover letter's tailored, make sure you know what they're working on, what their mission is, what their values are. I would say don't suck up too much, because when I see that cover letter, it's sort of really obvious, but you know, show that you have taken the time to learn about the institution, that you fit, show that you fit, and that you're interested and proactive, especially for the entry level. If you're keen to do things and learn and be open about things you don't know, don't try and sell yourself as this person that knows everything already, because you're not expected to. So if there are certain skills you don't have, then then be honest, but say you're willing to learn, because I think that goes a long way. And again, be persistent.
Thank you. There's lots of great advice there. Before I ask any more questions,
William, may I add one small thing, because I was also taking notes. So to what you just said, which I think it's very useful. I would also add the advice to show up. I mean, you have to create your own network. So this is a fairly small community, even in the UK, you know, of professionals and also people trying to get in. And there are tons of, you know, events, conferences, gatherings of any sorts. So show up and let the organizations, which essentially are the professionals working at those organizations, you know you, get to know you at a also personal level. That might, you know, make a difference beyond a cold or, you know, super cool CV or cover letter. But beyond that, I think it's always an asset to have these organizations to, you know, the ability to get to know you at a personal level. And also remember, and this builds on the you know, work on your own skill set. Remember that you're your own brands, so take good care of it. You will be accompanying yourself, obviously, everywhere, right? From one organization or platform to the next. So that's always useful and helpful to have in mind. Also, to try not to be diplomatic about it, because even within the non-partisan, you know, organizations, etc., it's always you know, helpful to bear in mind that, again, this is a small community, and that you might end up collaborating or working in a you know, with or at a different organization in the future. So the you know, the lower number of enemies you make along the way will be always helpful.
yeah, thank you very much now. So yeah, open up to the room. Has anyone got any questions for the panelists? Yes.
I've got two. One of them is pretty straightforward. The other one is a bit more convoluted. I'll start with the straightforward one.
Yeah.
So for an entry-level job in each of your think tanks, which IT skills should applicants possess right off the bat? And the second one, I'm not, I was not born in the UK, but I'm very, very interested in learning about and working in British politics. And, you know, from my conversations with people, something that's really, really important is media monitoring. You're watching different political shows that go on at different television channels. So, you know, each night I set out 1 hour for me to watch the BBC, to watch the coverage. But then I meet someone in the morning who has watched GB News, for example, where there's a lot of controversy going on, and you know that gets people talking. So what would you say would be a good schedule for someone who's new to British politics to get to know the British media and how politics is being reported?
Very interesting question. Thank you. Rosie, would like to go first?
Yeah, sure. So IT skills, it really depends on the role. If we're recruiting for an economist, there'll be a general assumption that they can do data analysis. I've never recruited for an economist, and I'm not an economist, but usually it stipulates on the job application. For me, if I was recruiting for someone, I'd want them to be able to use Word, PowerPoint, you know, basic things, be able to make a chart, that kind of stuff. Nothing particularly extensive. And also, like as Ben was saying, it's just basically about openness about your skills or lack thereof. Like if you can't do some of this stuff, but you want to know how to do it, you can always say, I don't know how to do this. I think it will be important. I'm happy to do some training when I start. But to be honest, it's pretty basic IT skills. For your media monitoring question, really good question about retaining kind of some balance in your media consumption, especially if you're trying to learn about it. I mean, like you say, you've obviously got, are you trying to learn about how Parliament works or how politics works in the UK?
Mostly how politics works.
Okay.
I have some basic knowledge of that because I've been following media even while I was growing in my home country. But nevertheless, I'm seeing so many people who are working in politics who are constantly monitoring all channels. And I'm thinking of a good recipe to try to guess that while doing all the other work that I have to do.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and it's really hard to keep on top of it. Like I literally work in a think tank, and some days I look at the news and I'm like, what? I didn't even know that was going on. I would recommend a few things. So does it have to be TV, or do you read, are you talking about like newspaper stuff as well? Sorry, I'm getting really specific.
What happens on social media and what the different newspaper outlets post on social media?
Yeah.
I've got that covered. But I'm thinking television wise and maybe printed paper as well.
Yeah, I would say, well, what I do to try and keep balance is I usually read weekly stuff as opposed to reading it every day, because I feel like you get a better curated roundup. If you're conscious of the fact that certain outlets have certain biases and you know that, and you keep that in mind when you're reading it, it's actually fine. So like, for example, I read The Economist, The New Statesman, The Spectator on a weekly basis, or at least I try to. On a daily basis, I'd say I listen to Radio 4 in the morning. The Today programme on Radio 4 is like Bible to anyone working in UK politics. The 8:10 interview on Radio 4, if anyone doesn't already know, is the golden spot. And everyone in politics listens to it every day. So I'd highly recommend listening to Radio 4 in the morning or in general. That would be my main recommendation. In terms of retaining balance, I think Twitter is the best place for retaining balance in your media consumption. That's where you find, and don't get me wrong, it sensationalizes things quite a lot, but it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of diversifying your media content. And then you can, as long as you're conscious that the Telegraph is slightly right wing, the Times is centre right, but it's not pro Boris. But if you basically just have a register in your head of what all of the different biases are, it becomes a lot easier. Another thing that's really good is also the Politico London playbook. I highly recommend that for just a solid run through of what's going on in politics. So two must-haves: Politico playbook, Radio 4, then Twitter, and then potentially finding weekly magazines.
And Ben, would you like to answer the question?
Just on the same one.
Yeah, so the IT skills.
Basic Microsoft Office package, I would say, just as long as you can use Excel, Word, Teams, Outlook, know how to send emails properly and have good sort of online manner. That is the basic. Most of the stuff we do is qualitative, but we wouldn't expect you necessarily to know how to use things like in vivo and things like that. Other think tanks, quant skills are useful, but not necessarily essential, especially at the entry level. But looking at skills in R, Starter, Python, that kind of stuff for quant analysis, but it varies. I think the media questions are pretty well covered, but just being aware of all the biases, because once you start reading them more regularly, it's very, very obvious and you can really see it. And I think the FT is also really good for more down the middle analysis.
Yeah, FT is actually really good at news reporting because they're reporting for bankers, and so they have to be kind of independent because like it affects the outcomes of markets and things. Like the purpose of their reporting is quite different. Downside of the FT is ridiculously expensive. Yes,
it is horrendously expensive. But I think UCL has a student membership, or at least it used to, because that expired when I left, which was quite annoying.
There was actually one more thing that made me think when you said it, but I can't remember what it was. But yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I would read some from the left, some from the right. So Guardian, Times, Telegraph.
Yeah, I think they're the best.
That's probably once you start getting lower down, it just gets a bit more ridiculous and a bit.
It's also-
waste of time.
It's also not even about what they're explicitly saying, although sometimes it is. It's about what they're not reporting. So like sometimes it's like an absence of like what they're basically their editorial agenda. Just think about that as well.
One more thing to listen to: The Rest is Politics podcast.
Yeah.
Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart. It's relatively new. It's on Spotify. Alistair Campbell was obviously the comms director for Tony Blair, and Rory Stewart was a Conservative MP who ran against Boris in the leadership election, but he's since quit the party. But they talk about their experiences a lot, analyse current affairs, and have a left-right balance with people who have been in government. So it's really, really good.
Yeah.
Every Wednesday, I think.
Yeah, it's very good.
What's the name, sorry?
The Rest is Politics podcast.
Is there anything else, Bonnie, that you'd like to add to that? Or
Yeah, I think all of the sources are recommended. I think I've listened to a lot of them, read a lot of them, very useful. And I think, as was mentioned, once you sort of have a basic idea of where they may be positioned ideologically, you can normally extract the information from those sources without necessarily taking those biases and asserting that as fact. I mean, I'm part of the policy and public affairs team, so I actually get quite a lot of information from data. So we use DODS monitoring services, YouGov. We keep up to date really with where stakeholders and the public are positioned on a lot of things. So I think the use of data as a source of information is actually really useful as well. And obviously it's quite easy to interpret because it's normally graphs, tables and so forth. So yeah, and in terms of digital skills, I mean, same as what's been mentioned, there's a general assumption that you know how to use the basic packages. We also use WordPress as we've got a website. So, but again, these are very basic things, and then they'll normally be advertised or spoken about in the interview. And generally the organisation would say that they'd help you to develop some sort of skills in those areas that you'd be able to use it. So yeah, so digital skills as a whole, generally pretty standard as what you'd use as part of your undergraduate or postgraduate degree. And I'd say just as an add-on, the use of data to sort of keep up to date with politics is a good way of staying updated. So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Juan, do you have anything to put on top of that?
I would add, so besides all of the above, which I think is very useful, I would again strongly encourage you to build your network, starting with building it, right? Because by doing this, you can essentially be, jumping the queue to some extent, meaning not only to read, for instance, or consume information, watching obviously for all the biases out there, but also listening to those that write the news. So for instance, if I want to learn about, and this is something, it requires some skills and it's a learning process, but you can develop this strategy from an early stage, I think. Right now you can start. That's what I did, and it has paid off. So, for instance, if I'm no expert in British politics, but if I want to know more about it, I will read about it, obviously. But I would also just send an email to an MEP or to an MP, sorry, and try to arrange a meeting with a chief of staff or someone working at the cabinet, etc. So I would be better informed at the same time. And at the same time, I would be growing my own network. If I want to, so for instance, what I did at the time was to reach out to the head of politics or opinion in every single Spanish major newspaper or media outlet. So I would both have the connection, and I would also be able to know firsthand what it is that they are writing, why they are writing, what they are not writing about, etc. So by doing that, you don't have to, again, that's what I mentioned, this thing of cutting the line or jumping the queue. You don't have to take all the steps people took previously, right, before you. You can just access to the information that those at the beginning of the line already have, which is very useful. And at the same time, again, you're also building and growing your own network. So have that network, have it permanently activated and access it on a regular basis. That also creates trust because information goes both ways, right? So as you progress, in your career, you'd also be sharing information. So they will be consulting you as much as you're consulting them.
Very interesting answer, thank you. So I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question about looking ahead. What are the challenges expected for the think tank policy, and what policy issues leads many of these think tank policies, especially for the Tony Blair Institute and Chatham House, are expecting in not just the 6 months to come, but a few years to come? And what are expected for future think tank writers, given the current rapid flow of information and big chunk amount of data? We call it the era of big data.
Ben, would you like to answer that first?
Sure. I might try and do a bit shorter and quicker answers so we can get some more questions in as well if there's time. Big challenges in terms of policy areas, I'd say climate change, governance, and governance could be sort of democratic governance challenges, multilateral governance, or governing emerging technology as well across all industries. So that can include data, social media, biotechnology, all of that kind of stuff. So I think those, and security and conflict, which kind of fits across all of them as well. So I think those are probably the some big policy areas off the top of my head. Challenges for think tanks as well, I think for all of them is funding, because some think tanks will collapse without funding because they simply won't be able to survive. But those are probably the biggest challenges, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, every think tank will have slightly different priorities going forward, depending on, say, their political leaning, etc. At the Tony Blair Institute we actually are an enormous organisation. We do loads of stuff. So we actually also have consultants in governments in Africa, and their priorities going forward will be slightly different for ours. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read about it, but we are doing a big conference at the end of June for the future of Britain. And so, you can take the man out of number 10, but you can't take number 10 out of Tony Blair, I don't think.
Excuse me, if I'd like to add up about Tony Blair Institute's presence, they are also consulting Indonesia's move of capital from Jakarta to Borneo. That's according to my dad.
Oh, right, yeah. I'm not too tapped into the advisory wing of the organisation. There's about 500 people. So, in terms of our priorities going forward in the UK policy side of things is the future of Britain. Kind of like the whole premise of New Labour was kind of revitalising the Labour Party and having a new vision for the future. So that, but not specifically to the Labour Party, generally for the future of Britain as a country. And that encapsulates technology, climate, Brexit, and various other things. In addition to that, technology policy is a huge priority of the Institute. But yeah, I'd broadly say future of Britain is a big priority for us over the next few years. It really depends on the political climate and what happens in politics as well. So yeah, I mean, what could be our priorities now might not be in a year. So it really depends.
Juan, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, so in terms of policy areas, I think greatly depends on the on the topics that any of these organizations or think tanks focus on, obviously, because for the most part they are topic specific organizations. Because of the circumstances, energy and security are hot topics today. I think at least they are in Spain or continental Europe. For the most part, Spain has also some security concerns with the southern border of Spain, both Spain and the EU. But in general, I think the current economic scenario is making think tanks work more and more heavily on welfare state issues from pensions to education to healthcare, meaning that to go deep into the sustainability, long-term sustainability, or even medium-term sustainability of the welfare state. So I would say those would be the main policy areas.
And Evie, has anything to add?
Yeah, so I mean, working for a exam board, the largest in the country, I mean, my experiences of what's the big issue is going to be quite different from everyone else's. So yeah, so I think within the education sphere at the minute, it's post-qualification progression, the impact of not achieving a standard pass of GCSE maths and English, also the skills deficit in the workforce. So that's really becoming quite a big issue, and obviously that can extend into other areas such as automation of jobs and things like that. But I think something worth remembering is that with any job that you're applying for, I think it's good to have a basic idea of some of these big themes, but generally there is not going to be an expectation that you're an expert. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind, and don't spend too much time just sort of looking into all these different areas. And also stemming from earlier, I think one of the major skills that you can have is being able to communicate very complex ideas very simply. That is one of the major things that I've sort of learned through the job that I'm doing. So sort of going through different areas, like you were saying, and being able to put that into a tweet or something like that, that is a really, really good skill that's valued very highly. So yeah.
But it should also be based, I agree with that. Like my general rule is that like any small thing you come out with that's like a sentence long has like an iceberg of thought beneath it.
Yeah.
Like it still has to be really calculated, but you just need to be able to.
Not too simplistic. So you're talking about, I don't know, America's foreign policy in like 2 sentences, but generally being able to sort of get that key idea that really makes people think is a really good skill to have.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Great answers. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end there, but it's been an extraordinary hour, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to bring it to a close here. But so for those listening, we still have some amazing events for the rest of the day, so stay around and check those out. If you haven't already, join the UCL Political Science LinkedIn. Other than that, thank you very much to our panelists, those who joined us in the room and those online. Thank you very much.